welcome to Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Brown. It's clearer than ever that in the face of state abandonment, atomization under neoliberalism, and now a resurgent fascist movement, that we need to build our own infrastructures, spaces in which we can organise and resist, but also to foster community and conviviality. We face many overlapping crises, one of which, housing, has resulted in the emergence of a new wave of tenant unions. From the streets of Los Angeles to the avenues of Berlin, these new unions are rising up to demand good, affordable housing for all, and in the process are rewriting the playbook on community empowerment and direct action. In today's episode, I'm joined by Jacob Stringer, a housing and social movements researcher and organiser who is the author of an exciting new book, Renters Unite: How Tenant Unions Are Fighting the Housing Crisis. Jacob and I discuss the many local and international dimensions to housing crisis in countries across the global north. We talk about why simply building more houses may not be enough, and explore some of the injustices experienced by renters and those in temporary accommodation. We also talk about the new wave of tenant unions and how their tactical and strategic orientations overlap and diverge as a result of the contexts in which they're organising. As ever, followers of the podcast can get the book Renters Unite for 40% off through plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. Okay, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jacob Stringer on Radicals in Conversation. I hope you enjoy the episode. So, Jacob, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's really exciting to talk to you about your new book. Well, still new. It came out in February, so I consider that a new book. It's called Renters Unite: How Tenant Unions Are Fighting the Housing Crisis. So, probably quite clear to listeners and viewers what that's all about. But let's start with some fundamentals, as ever. So maybe you could just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your political background? And what drew you to the London Renters Union, I guess, and tenant organising in general?
Yes, thank you, and thank you so much for having me on. I have been involved in various types of left activism for some time, since the early 2000s, and prior to getting involved in tenant organising, I've been involved in a sort of local autonomous community centre. I, like a lot of people, had started thinking about, organising at slightly bigger scale. And I heard about London Renters Union, which was starting up as a project. It was not yet launched as a union, and thought, well, that sounds really great. That's the type of thing I'm looking for, because I think there's a great need at the moment for scaling up our organising, and London Renters Union, it was always an ambitious project. It always aimed to be a large renters union with many thousands of members, and as it has turned into, so I was very drawn to the scale side of the project, but obviously there was also, it was clear that the housing crisis in London was just getting worse and worse, that the issue wasn't going to go away, and that it was necessary to do some grassroots organising to address the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll certainly be talking more about the London Renters Union and other tenant unions. The book sort of gives space to many from around the global north, I guess, in particular. The global south is sort of left to one side for reasons which we might get into. But let's talk first about housing crisis. You mention, I think, in the introduction to the book, the puzzlement of an Argentinian housing activist that you spoke to recently at the idea that London has a housing crisis. In Latin America, housing crisis sort of manifests itself a lot more in the form of informal settlements, land occupations, and so on, which isn't so much the case in a city like London, although you do see people living in tents around the city. So, yeah, we have listeners and viewers all around the world, but let's start off by talking, I guess, about the reality of housing crisis here in Britain, and we can sort of venture elsewhere. So, in a place like London in particular, how does housing crisis sort of manifest itself?
Yes, so in London and in most of the UK, there's a lot of what we might call hidden homelessness, and that's the biggest manifestation of the housing crisis. The reason it's hidden is partly because there is still a duty on local authorities to house people. Now that duty is underfunded, and there's lots of problems with how it's enacted, which we can get into. But partly as a result of that, you don't see as many people on the streets in the UK as you would in the US, for example. And instead, what homelessness looks like is a range of things. It means, people sleeping on friends' sofas for months, sometimes years. It means two families living in a house when really they'd like to be just alone. It means overcrowding for enormous numbers of families, families with 3-4 children in 2-bedroom houses. It means a lot of people in temporary accommodation, which is the local authority solution when they need to house somebody but they don't have a council house to put them in. They don't have a proper publicly owned home to put them in. So they go into temporary accommodation, which is usually privately owned, usually very substandard quality. The people get moved around as well. So if you're in temporary accommodation, the council can move you at any time. They can move you out of London, and often do. They place people around the country. Sometimes, if you're lucky, in inverted commas, you might get displaced from London into a permanent council house. But quite often you'll just get displaced from London into temporary accommodation, which is no kind of permanent home at all. The other thing it looks like is, it used to be, when I was younger, that most people in this country, when they became adults, they moved out of their parental home. That was a little different from, say, some parts of southern Europe, where it was much more common for kids to stay at home for longer. But it used to be that nearly everyone tried to move out of their parents' house and set up their own home somehow, even if it was just house sharing. Increasingly, kids are going back home to their parents because they just can't take the rent anymore, and they don't want to be living there, and sometimes their parents don't want them to be living there. But that's what's happening to really enormous numbers of young people at the moment.
Yeah, just to take it back to temporary accommodation for a second, I saw, as I was preparing for this podcast, I was just on the Guardian website, and there was an article on the homepage yesterday which was suggesting that in some local authorities in England, the wait for a sort of family-sized social housing, so I guess a 3-bedroom house sort of size, it's 100 years in the worst local authorities. I think Westminster, maybe the waiting time was 100 years for one of those homes to be available. And actually that in 32 different local authority areas, the wait for a home with at least 3 bedrooms was longer than 18 years, which is the duration of an entire childhood. So there were many more ridiculous stats that appeared in this article, but it's pretty damning, really, at the state of affairs as they are now.
Yes, and I've met families living in temporary accommodation who've been there for most of their children's childhoods, and it's really not a good place for them to be. It's not, because this place never feels like your home, right? You can get moved around at any time, at the whim of the council, and you often are. And being moved around when you're a family is an entirely different thing from being moved around when you're single. Because although it's always a tragedy to lose your community, often kids are in school, right? And they can get moved to the other side of London, and they're told, well, either you can move school or you can take a bus 2 hours across London to get to your school. This is a terrible way to live, obviously, and it takes a toll in mental health, in family life, and so on. And as I say, the actual outcome for a lot of people is that they get displaced from London. So there's this big sort of fairly hidden displacement going on, unless you happen to know people in temporary accommodation, you might not necessarily notice it happening. But people being moved to cities hundreds of miles from London, away from anyone they know, in order to accommodate them. Of course, this all results to a significant extent from the selling off of council housing, which started under Thatcher and was welcomed by many people who wanted to buy at the time, many council tenants who wanted to buy at the time. And they were given good discounts. So from an individual point of view, it made sense for them. But we've had a steadily diminishing public housing stock in this country as a result. And it's really having catastrophic effects on people's lives now.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Thatcher there, which is obviously a local example to the UK, which doesn't apply in other contexts, but is certainly a crucial local historical factor here. I mean, I think many of us understand on some level that the housing crisis is not principally caused by a straightforward lack of housing. It's not just that there aren't enough houses, although, as you say, there is reduced sort of public housing stock. It's not to say that we shouldn't build more houses, therefore, if we were going to try and address it, but it's just not necessarily a guarantee that houses will suddenly become affordable and sort of geographically dispersed in the right places and that the crisis will end. Are there any examples? I think maybe there's one in the book where you talk about Spain, where actually it isn't necessarily a lack of housing that's the problem. Could you say a bit more about some of the nuances here?
So, of course, the claim of a lot of people is simply that housing is a matter of supply and demand. If you build more housing, then it will become cheaper, and that will help everyone out. What I point out in the book is it's quite difficult to come up with examples where this straightforward supply and demand story has been a success, and where lots of building has led to a reduction in house prices. And when you think about it, there's obvious reasons for this, right? Private developers, if you leave the building of properties to private developers, they're not going to build if it reduces house prices. It's simply not in their interest to do that. So it's really a strange idea that private developers are going to solve the housing crisis. It's not what motivates them. They're motivated by making lots of money. So the example in Spain is a now historical example, really, because the housing situation in Spain has really moved on since then. But prior to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, prior to that crisis, there was a huge building boom in Spain, and enormous amounts of properties were being built. In some places, they weren't even getting filled up, and but in order to sell these properties, finance had to be made available to more and more people who actually couldn't really afford it. So then it became part of the story of the financial crisis, a massive housing crash in Spain, when it turned out that really a lot of these mortgages shouldn't really have been given, and people couldn't afford to keep them up, and it was a financial disaster for the entire country. So part of what you're seeing there is the complicating story in the supply demand story, which a lot of politicians don't really like to talk about, which is that price of housing significantly depends on how much money there is available to buy it. You can build more housing and it not get cheaper because there's more money flooding into it. And this money can come from private equity, it can come from pension funds, it can come from well-off people who can now, buy houses to let, as has happened on quite a large scale in the UK. And the more money is made available, often through credit. So these buy-to-let mortgages in the UK, they simply made lots more money available to flow into housing, and that put the prices up. It was really nothing to do with the underlying supply and demand at all. It's quite a tricky thing to talk about sometimes, because talking about sort of financial shenanigans in the city or technical types of mortgage provision is quite boring. But unfortunately, it is a part of what's happened to the housing system, not just in the UK, but around the world. And this is a commonality around the world. There's lots of countries that haven't seen the decline in public housing that the UK has seen. Either they never had it or their public housing has been maintained. But they still have enormously expensive private housing, enormously expensive rental markets. And that now includes, places that used to be cheaper, like Berlin or something. And that's because money has been flowing into property around the world on a very large scale.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you make a really key point in the book, which explains that there are kind of two markets for housing which have divergent interests. On the one hand, you have people who are seeking a home in which to live, sees housing as home, and on the other hand, you have investors and speculators who are seeking rent. And these markets are sort of intertwined, and there are sort of, I guess, consequences for people in that first group. And I guess maybe attendant to that is, what you talk about in the last couple of decades being this rise in the asset management industry, typically being bad news for renters. You actually call into question the value or accuracy of the term the housing crisis itself in the book, which I thought was quite interesting. So, why do you find that framing unhelpful?
Well, because the crisis sounds like something that you stumbled into by accident. And when it's been going on for 25 years, you start thinking, well, if it was an accident, maybe we would have resolved it by now. And I think a lot of people who look at this term housing crisis sort of start scratching their head about it. I noticed that Tracy Rosenthal, who is from Los Angeles Tenant Union and wrote a book recently called Abolish Rent, she also called into question this category of housing crisis. It's such a strange term, because the more you look into it, the more you understand that it's happening because it benefits certain people, and therefore it's being deliberately engineered to happen like that. It seems silly to call something a crisis when it's been done as a matter of policy over several decades. It doesn't really quite make sense. And really, it makes more sense to talk about things like housing injustice. This is the situation that we have been pushed into by people in power who decided that ever-rising house prices were a great thing, and have actually done quite a lot in policy terms to enable those prices to rise and rents to rise.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that comes through in the book is that, talking about private renting, it's expensive to be poor and it's very cheap to be rich in the way that things kind of operate now. I think there's, a case you highlight in the book of a woman who was compelled to pay 6 months rent up front in the contract that she had to sign with the agent, not just as a deposit, but every sort of 6 months. When the next 6 months came around, she would be required to pay 6 months in one big tranche. I think that speaks to this, who can afford that, right? And sort of the fact that rent can swallow up, more than half of a lot of people's take-home pay means it's incredibly difficult to save, and you sort of get trapped in that cycle. And, you're trapped in a cycle where the rents are sort of also going up year on year. So it feels like inequality and sort of a widening inequality seems to be at the heart of the non-housing crisis, if you will. Does that ring true to you?
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of people in the global north who are poor right now and perhaps struggle to buy food even, they're really poor because of their housing. If they had affordable housing, they would be able to buy food. So what you end up with is a cycle of increasing poverty. People have to lay out enormous amounts. As you say, sometimes they're asked to provide rent for months up front. In fact, the UK government is currently trying to pass a bill that may limit the ability of landlords to demand that. We don't know if it will get through yet. But obviously for someone on a low income to produce you know, 6 months' rent could potentially be £8,000, let's say. To produce that as a lump sum up front, it's a ridiculous thing to require of people. And of course, what happens is people borrow the money, so they get into debt to do it. And as the rent is paid, really the money is being transferred upwards within society. So the people who own the properties are benefiting, and the people who are living in the properties are getting poorer. And it's really a big part of the picture of increasing inequality in quite a lot of countries of the global north at the moment. And there's no signs of it stopping anytime soon. People are simply getting poorer and poorer as their housing costs go up and up.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, you alluded to this kind of Labour introduced bill in Parliament. I think it's the Renters' Rights Bill. I'm assuming that's the one you were talking about. And I guess, I had a question here, which is a very basic question, a bit of a straw man question with an obvious answer, why people might not go to their landlord with an issue, if they're living in a house with black mold, with, faulty or broken appliances and so on. A lot of people don't want to go to their landlord with that kind of thing. And that's just been very much normalised. So is this the kind of thing that the Renters' Rights Bill is supposedly going to address?
Yeah, that's right. So in the UK, you can be evicted for no reason at all, a no-fault eviction. And that means that while technically your landlord is not allowed to evict you for asking for repairs, in reality, it happens quite a lot. People are scared of being evicted. People are also scared of their property being repaired because this is a horrible situation, because they know that if the landlord comes in and totally revamps their property and makes it actually a nice place to live, that they're not going to be able to afford the rent there anymore. And so people are very loath to ask for improvements to their property a lot of the time. Unfortunately, a lot of landlords were sold the idea that they could get a passive income, just money coming in from being a landlord. And in fact, of course, to look after a property takes constant work, which people know about their own properties, but somehow when they're letting out a property, they pretend that it's not the case. And so often just, over quite long periods of time, the investment has not been going into properties, and they're just degrading, and people living in worse and worse conditions. Now, the Renters' Rights Bill is abolishing no-fault evictions if it goes through. We think it will go through, although there's a lot of lobbying behind the scenes from or out in the open from landlords to water down all the provisions in the bill, and various other ways in which people might get evicted are probably going to be made easier in this bill. But no-fault evictions will technically come to an end. That should, in theory, make it easier for people to ask for improvements to their property, because, as I say, you aren't allowed, a landlord is not allowed to evict someone for asking for repairs. But that all depends on enforcement. So a lot of the stuff that is in the Renters' Rights Bill that on paper is good depends on enforcement by local authorities that have been radically defunded over the last couple of decades. So it's very questionable how much the improvements are actually going to take place on the ground.
That's a really good point. So I guess, I, like many people, scroll on Instagram Reels a lot of the time, and a lot of what I get served is, Gary Stevenson, Gary's Economics, little clips from what he's out there saying. I think I saw one the other day where he was saying he expects house prices to double in the next few years. And, you just mentioned there the idea of this passive income that landlords just expect to be able to get, which is ironic given how sort of hardline all governments in this country have been about people at the bottom getting money without having to sort of work or but that doesn't seem to apply. The logic doesn't apply if you're of the landlord class. But, is this kind of the rentier economy? I think you talk about the rentier economy in the book. which seems to be marked by this doom spiral of ever increasing inequality. So do you think, firstly, a prognosis like, the one that Gary put out there, that prices could double in the next 5 years, do you think that's plausible in this context? And do you think, therefore, we're seeing a sort of a generational divide in terms of property ownership? Generation rent, that's a term we're all probably familiar with as well.
I do think house prices are going to continue to rise. I probably don't have enough of a technical analysis to tell you by how much they're going to rise. But I think the underlying drivers of the house price rises that we've seen have not gone away. And we don't have governments who are willing to deal with them. And in fact, in the UK, we now have the Labour government who's sort of invited in the asset managers to ask them how to help house people. Now, if you believe that will reduce house prices, then I have a bridge to sell you. Obviously, the asset managers only want to buy into housing knowing that it's going to rise. And so it all becomes a part of the problem. And so in the UK, we've got a couple of sort of different types of landlord money coming into the system. One is from individual landlords, and it can be people just trying to supplement their pensions and so on. And now we've got money coming in from the asset management industry, big private equity groups, people who manage enormous amounts of money, and they're just looking for a return. But when they do their calculations about the return they need to get, the return is not just the rent. They are expecting property price rises as well. Those dynamics have not only not been addressed, but it seems that governments largely want to make them worse. They're actually pretending that Blackstone and BlackRock are going to help solve the housing crisis. Inviting those players in will absolutely only put prices up. It will put property prices up, it will put rental prices up, because they will only really operate in a market like that, and they will help to lobby politically to make sure that their assets are protected. Their assets being your homes, which will become increasingly unaffordable. So the generational side of things, it's definitely the case in the UK and in many countries that 2 or 3 decades ago it was much easier to buy a house. And there's now a younger generation who really, really struggle. They can't even save up a deposit because all their money is going out in rent. So there's something to the generational divide, but it's also that's not the complete story. So there are some divisions within that. So in reality, as you may know from people some people can get their parents to help them buy a house, and they do on a large scale. Is very, very common, and sometimes their parents are comfortably enough off that that's just cash they've got in the bank. Sometimes, though, parents do even remortgage their houses in order to help their children get on the housing ladder. So that actually opens up a division within the younger generation between people whose parents can help them and people whose parents can't. It's also the case that, some people, some section of the population who can't currently afford housing, if they're young, their salary might go up with time, and in time they might be able to buy. And then other people, their salaries are not going to go up so much. Maybe, they haven't been to university, they can't get graduate level jobs, then there's more of a ceiling to how much they're going to be able to earn. And that, and then their case is much more hopeless. They really can't see a time when they can ever buy. Now, tenants' unions tend not to emphasise the generational divide too much. And that's because you're trying to organise with people, and really you need to focus on what people have in common rather than what separates them. And there are plenty of older people stuck in poor quality rental accommodation, and there are younger people who are going to be okay in the long run. From an organising perspective, it's quite important to focus on what people have in common, which is that enormous amounts of their income are being taken from them for their housing.
Yeah. Well, it seems like a good opportunity to talk about tenants' unions then, which is, I guess, really what the book is about. We've, laid out some of the groundwork about the context in which there's been this new wave, I guess, of tenant unions that's emerged, which is not to say that, tenant organising is a new phenomenon. It's been around for a number of decades. But what kind of approach characterised that earlier wave of tenants' unions? And then how is this new wave that we've seen in the last, 10 years or so, how is that wave that's emerged kind of differing in terms of its politics or of its goals, strategies, and so on?
So there's an earlier wave of tenant unions that some of them still exist, and particularly across Europe, actually. And what they tend to focus on is enforcing people's existing rights. And they can be very good at that. The German tenant unions are very aggressive in defence of your existing tenants' rights. And some of the older tenant unions in the US as well. And they're doing a certain job, but one of the realizations that people have come to is that the existing rights that people have are not enough. It's really not cutting it. And so the new generation of tenant unions tend to be more radical. They tend to be anti-capitalist in flavour in varying ways, because they see capitalism as a key cause of housing crisis. They tend to be using direct action, really making a fuss. And the direct action happens because your existing rights aren't enough, And so the new tenant unions, it's not that they ignore existing rights. Sometimes London Renters Union is just making sure that a landlord obeys the existing law. And sometimes that is enough to help a member. But quite often it isn't, because quite often the particular way in which you are getting screwed by your landlord is perfectly legal and legitimate. And so the new wave of tenant unions is saying, well, the laws aren't good enough. The entire framework of our housing system is not working. We need to challenge it all. It's clear that the people in charge are not going to do anything about this, because they've allowed it to continue for decades at this point. So they're not going to do anything about it. So we are going to have to push from the base. We're going to have to push from the bottom up, do grassroots organising, develop a movement of people who understand that the housing system has to radically change. And to a large extent, it's focused on housing cannot be an investment and a home at the same time. You have to de-emphasize housing as investment in order to get housing as a good home. And because governments are very unwilling to do that, the tenant unions all generally have an understanding that they're in a big fight with the people in power, a really big fight against both the politicians and the capital that is chasing housing and chasing returns. Increasingly, the tenant unions understand it to be a global fight and are connecting up with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the book it's really great in showing how the sort of context in, geographical context, so, national context or whatever, that a tenant union has emerged from within will shape a lot of the ways it goes about organising, the tactics it uses, the way it tries to recruit people, and obviously there'll be different legal regimes they're operating in. So there's a lot of differences. You can't sort of generalise in that sense about what the tenant unions that you kind of discuss in the book, which you use examples from around Europe, Ireland, Britain, the US, and sort of further afield. So there's a lot of difference there. There are also a lot of commonalities. And I think one thing that comes through is how part of the mission of these tenant unions seems to be to reconstitute communities, that have been plundered and divided by neoliberalism. And sort of coming back to what we were talking about, how if you're in temporary accommodation, for instance, you might get, or even just a private renter, you might find yourself geographically displaced and displaced. So, average tenancies last only a year or so in this country, I think. So it can feel very atomizing as well if you're constantly moving around. Very hard to find community, find local community in that sort of transient sort of space. I think I rented in London for like 10 years, lived in 5 different boroughs all around the city. So, we never really built that kind of lasting community. And it feels like at the fundamental level, if you don't know your neighbours' names, how can you ever hope to build collective power over sort of housing issues? So yeah, could you say a little bit more about this idea of, creating community rather than, working through existing communities, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, this is about a goal of many of the new tenant unions that is almost as important as addressing the housing crisis, which is a lot of the people who set up tenant unions have understood that society has become very atomized. The reason we see very little large-scale left-wing organising is significantly because it's been undermined previously. There was previous larger-scale organising, often in the workplace. Enormous amounts of efforts have gone into destroying that organising from, people in positions of power. And we're now in this situation where most people are probably not involved in any kind of political organising. Most people in large cities particularly, don't really know their neighbours very well, and not living in anything they would call a community. They also don't necessarily have some of the links of the past. In the UK, it's not very common to be a religious churchgoer, for example. Some people are, but it's not very common at all, and that's true in a lot of Europe. And so these places that used to be a focus for community have also kind of dissipated. This is a somewhat engineered situation, I would say. When Margaret Thatcher decided to sell off council houses, she was specifically trying to reconstitute people as individuals who would simply seek their own self-interest. And this is what we're seeing now is the end result of the neoliberal project, is the technical term, but what it means is trying to turn everyone into private actors who don't act collectively, and who simply compete against each other. Obviously, that competition massively advantages people who already have money and power, and that's a big part of the reason why this situation has been created. So tenant unions are also a way of addressing this atomization arising from the neoliberal period. They're a way of trying to reconstitute community. If that all sounds a bit abstract, it is about getting people to know their neighbours. It is about getting people to organise together with their neighbours, to eat food together with their neighbours. London Renters Union puts emphasis on getting people to eat together, and that's social time, and that's time in which you really get to know each other. And across the global north, I think more and more people have seen the need to try and rebuild community where often very little community is left, and do your organising in a way that creates new community. And I think that's a really exciting thing about the new wave of tenant unions, is they have explicitly set out to create people who are organised with each other, with their neighbours, and as they scale up and as they grow, we really hope that will make the way that you live feel different. It's about sort of how you inhabit the space you're in as well. Los Angeles Tenant Union talks about this quite a lot, and I talk about it in the book. What is the space you inhabit? Does it feel like your space? And as you start to take collective action with your neighbours, more and more begins to feel like this is your space. You can get control of it. It can also alleviate, some of the general ills of modern life, loneliness and isolation, people feeling unsupported. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just talking about your space, I really enjoyed reading about the LA Tenants Union in the book, and I thought it was really interesting how whenever they have some sort of meeting with the landlord, and this is a difference, I guess, to the British context where you have something like 2 million sort of landlords who might only own one property or something. When they're organising, they're often organising in blocks where there's just a single landlord. But I think you kind of mention in the book how they always make sure that if they're having a meeting with the landlord comes into their space, rather than going to the landlord's office, which I guess is just an interesting way of reaffirming that housing is home rather than just something in a property portfolio. So that was very interesting. And I thought that the emphasis on sociality that really emerges in that kind of example of the LATU as well was really interesting and definitely sort of spot on.
And they see it as they organise in a way that emphasises this is your home, but also that tries to change the sense of what home is. Home is not just a place where you go and shut the door and don't talk to anyone else. Home is a place where you can make connections with other people. You can build collectivity with other people and take action with them.
It's really interesting hosting this show and reading a lot of our books, because things that pop up in one book will then feel like they resonate with another conversation. So I had a conversation with the authors of Transfemme Futures a couple of months back, and one passage in that book, which I think we talked about on the show, was that solidarity has a longer breath than, I guess, right-wing politics or something. And actually that seems to resonate here, because I think you talk in the book about how, London Renters Union, for instance, has deliberately chosen to take a slower route when it's building up its membership, building up its branches. It hasn't lent into, recruitment via social media, for instance, so much, because that might just attract one sort of coterie of, let's say sort of young, white, lefty activists. And it's deliberately seeking to sort of avoid that. And I think, you point to, London Renters Union, but also the Crown Heights Tenant Union in Brooklyn, and I think there's others in the book, as examples of organising that are really trying to bring together, for instance, older black women and these, young university-educated white people in a way that these groups might not interact otherwise, in spite of the geographical proximity with which they might live in a city. And this, is also at the heart of one of Pluto's sort of partner organisations, the Stuart Hall Foundation. Their programme this year is titled In Search of Common Ground. It's all about thinking across difference. And so, I think it's true that if everyone involved in a tenant union has the same background, that's going to be a problem. So what was really interesting is seeing how much that is emphasised, creating this space of encounter between people of different, class backgrounds, racial backgrounds, and that makes for a stronger union. Could you say a little bit more about, some of this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a key way of thinking of a lot of the new tenant unions, is moving out beyond the constituency of young people who are often drawn to left-wing political activism, perhaps in university and so on. So firstly, I mean, if you want to be a big organisation, you've got to get out beyond that group of people, right? But secondly, it's worth recognising that people try to organise in their own ways, and in their own places. So in Crown Heights Tenant Union, a lot of the people who are now members of the union, they did have a past of organising, whether in trade unions or in or in their housing. A lot of black women members of the union didn't just get drawn into it by the appeal created by younger, energetic members. They were already organising, and it was about bringing together people of different organising experience. But it is also about trying to break that sort of stratification within society where, in fact, it's part of this atomization of society that you tend to just socialise with people of your own economic strata and your own background. Quite often, it's relatively uncommon to even move out of your strata, but then interaction between the different stratas in society is quite uncommon, and that just benefits the people in charge, because then people feel alone and divided. So it's absolutely vital to any sort of large-scale organising that you be organising across different groups of people. Now, you can also see this as kind of a resource almost. The people in different parts of society have different knowledge, different experience, and it's important to bring those together. It is true that when London Renters Union started organising, it wasn't particularly focused on temporary accommodation, and that was because a lot of the people involved did not have experience of temporary accommodation. Because they weren't from the socio-economic strata that tends to experience that more. So the growing of the union, the bringing in more people, meant that there were more places, more ways of organising. So it's something that most tenant unions think quite a lot about. They're very intentional about it. They're thinking, well, this can't be a tenant union of people who just look like me. It has to be a tenant union for everyone. And that makes it stronger in the long run, both in terms of numbers, but in terms of the type of life experience people have, the types of cultures and so on that they can bring to the organising process. So, yeah, that's very important for most of the tenant unions I talk about in the book.
I suppose there's, and you talk about this in the book as well, but like there are then, I guess, tensions between what is sometimes explicit, but often more of an implicit sort of anti-capitalism that a lot of these tenant unions have, and yet trying to build a sort of broad membership base from all walks of life will necessarily mean that you're bringing people into the union who may not be avowedly anti-capitalist and actually might be quite hostile to that position. So there can be some of these tensions between trying to have a sort of prefigurative politics, which can sometimes maybe be a bit sort of subcultural and quite alienating, perhaps. And yet the kind of the logic, the understanding is that capitalism is ultimately causing a lot of these problems. So could you say a little bit more about some of these tensions and how they're sort of dealt with in the day-to-day sort of operating of the unions?
Yes, so I think this tension that arises in tenant unions is a tension that you're likely to get any time that you do big organising that tries to be radical, because it's the nature of things that relatively smaller groups of people tend to have the radical opinions. So as soon as you try to get really big, you start recruiting people who, at least when you recruit them, don't think and talk as radically as you do. There are a couple of ways that you can react to this, and none of them are more valid than the other. It's about walking this fine line. So, some tenant unions tone down their rhetoric significantly. They don't talk that much about being anti-capitalist, even if the ideas about housing they're talking about are basically anti-capitalist. Some tenant unions put a lot of work into political education, trying to recruit people who aren't so radical and then try and move their opinions a little bit. And some tenant unions also, they're just like, okay, we're going to talk about our radicalism, but you don't have to agree with this. We can just be tenants fighting together. You don't have to agree with everything we're saying. It's a tension that doesn't quite get resolved all the time, and I think that's fine. It's not necessarily a resolvable tension. I think it can be potentially a mistake to assume that you set up a tenant union, let's say, or you've been part of setting up a tenants union, and you see yourself as having radical politics. It might be a mistake to assume that your radical politics is entirely correct. It could be that what you need to do is learn a little bit from the people you're recruiting, have a conversation with them, and say and think, well, are there different ways of being radical? That's a process that is quite difficult because it involves questioning yourself and your core beliefs. But I think it's quite important because although to some people what I'm talking about might sound a bit like compromise, it's not compromise with the ruling class. It's compromise with the people you're working with. And maybe it is just going to be helpful for the growth of your tenant union to talk about housing in a slightly different way, or to talk about the financial system in a slightly different way. Maybe it's going to be helpful to focus on what you think housing should look like. And there's an anti-capitalist vision embedded within what you think housing should look like, but you're not so focused on what it is you're against. You're just focused more on what you're for. So these are quite difficult issues, and I would say not all tenant unions have fully reached their final position on them. A challenge I would throw out to tenant union members is you do have to think about the question of, are you a tenant union for every tenant in your city, or are you a tenant union for the anti-capitalist tenants in your city? If you go with the latter, you're going to be a somewhat smaller tenants union, significantly smaller. So it's a difficult line to walk. It takes a lot of thought to understand how it is you can grow a large organisation, remain radical, pull on board people who are not so radical, and some of them are never going to be declared anti-capitalists, and you have to accept that if you want your organisation to really be big, particularly if you want, and London Renters Union talks about this sometimes, if you want to normalise being in a tenants union. If you just want that to be like something people casually mention at work to each other without having to explain it, then you are going to recruit people who have somewhat different politics to you. So how to process all this is one of the challenges of the new wave of tenant unions. And it can feel a bit easier in places like Barcelona or Berlin, where there's many more people who might explicitly say that they're anti-capitalist than in London or Los Angeles.
Yeah. There's two things I guess I would like to talk about based on what we've been saying there. I mean, one is talking about bridging some potential divides within the membership. You talk about rent control in the book as serving a pretty unifying sort of strategic demand around which pretty much all members, whether they're sort of activists, anti-capitalists, just kind of regular members, they can all just pretty much agree around fighting for rent control. So I'd be interested to hear you say a little bit about that. And then I want to ask some stuff around the construction of like renter and tenant subjectivities and some stuff around narrative, but we'll maybe do that second. So yeah, could you tell us a bit about rent control as a strategic demand?
So rent control is something most tenant unions can agree is a positive thing, and most members within a tenant union can agree is a positive thing. And that's because it can have immediate beneficial impacts on people's lives. If the rent control is strong enough, it can essentially make you better off. Less of your money is being wasted on landlords, and you have more money to yourself. That is, something that pretty much any tenant can agree is a positive thing. Now, people hold this idea of rent controls in different ways. For some people, the rent control might be the ultimate end goal. You get decent rent control, you're done. Your tenant union has succeeded. For other people, what they're thinking more is, okay, so rent control is a partial decommodification of housing, but only partial. So we do need to win rent control, but then we'll have to push it further. If we don't want housing to be a commodity anymore, if we don't want it just to be an asset for investment, we're really going to have to push it further than rent control. Now, it's also the case that there's different types of rent control. And so even the cities that have rent control in the US, for example, and there's a number of them, and some countries in Europe have some types of rent control. Not all rent control is equal. And the reason, for instance, rent control in Berlin is not effective enough at stopping rising rent prices is because at the end of the tenancy and change over to a new tenancy, the property returns to market price. Now, that is actually the most common form of rent control in the US as well. And it doesn't actually stop prices from rising. So even when you have won some type of rent control, often you think, well, we need to go further. We need to establish rent control between tenancies so that there's essentially not really such a thing as a market price. There's just a rent that is deemed affordable to everyone. Now, that is a very hard form of rent control to win, and what it means is that there's always something to aim for. There's always something more to aim for, right? So the demand for rent control is both about winning improvements in people's lives now, but also about, well, we as tenants need to exert control over our housing. And this is one way to exert control. It's not the only way, but it's a good start in a lot of places. Or if we have some rent control, we can make it better. We can tighten it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a thing that comes through in the book is how a lot of the tenant unions you talk about, they seem to have kind of different levels that they're operating on. Some of which might be sort of technical changes they're trying to get to the housing system. Some might be more sort of social democratic solutions like home building, and then some might be more long-term and sort of about challenging capitalism itself. So, I did say I wanted to talk about the construction of like renter and tenant subjectivity, which I thought was quite interesting as like a part of what might make for a successful and strong tenant union. In the way that traditional workplace union organizing relies on building a certain kind of class consciousness, maybe an understanding of like workers and bosses in a duality. The idea that tenant organizing also requires this sort of construction to some extent, of a tenant subjectivity. So understanding oneself in relationship to the landlord or landlordism, maybe. So, I was kind of wondering how foundational you think this is to the success of tenant unions, and sort of how easy or not it is to build this kind of subjectivity or identity.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of tenant union organisers have put a lot of thought into what it is that brings us together as tenants, and trying to think about, well, we're all having the same experience, right? We are experiencing having a large percentage of our income removed by our landlords, which then leaves us with very little money for ourselves. We're experiencing bad housing conditions, disrepair. We're experiencing instability, insecurity, and we do not feel in control of our homes. So a lot of tenant unions have thought, well, this is the basis for creating a new type of subjectivity, a new type of sort of collective self, where we start to say we identify as renters, as tenants, and we are being screwed in the same ways, and therefore we need to collectively be tenants, acting together in order to fight for better housing for ourselves. It's also the case that the different tenant unions take slightly different approaches with this, and some tenant unions do actually simply talk more about the working class and say, well, we are the working class, we are a particular subset of the working class, the tenants within it, but mostly we talk about organising the working class. And of course the reason for that is that an awful lot of leftist thinking is built around creating the working class as an active collectivity, and you can see tenant organising as simply a part of that. I think in reality a lot of tenant unions actually sort of take a mixed approach to this. They talk about the working class, they talk about tenants, sometimes they talk about tenants as a class position, and I wouldn't say that I've necessarily seen a tenant union that has magically worked out what the best formula is for creating that renter collectivity. A lot of it is similar to organising in the workplace. It's about making people conscious of the position they're in. So a lot of people don't necessarily know that they have a bad landlord. They just put up with the disrepair, right? But everybody they know puts up with the disrepair. So it's just normalised. And then you join a tenants union and you think, oh, actually, no, I shouldn't be putting up with it. Why am I putting up with this? And that collectivity of experience begins to change the way you think, and you begin to see yourself as a group of people opposed to landlords. Now, I think this is still an ongoing process. I don't think that tenant unions have necessarily reached their conclusions on what the best way is to create a large-scale sort of collectivity that thinks of itself as renters, acts together. This is still in construction. You know, a lot of these tenant unions are still quite young, and they're still working on their ideas and their modes of action. They're sort of experimental arenas to some extent still. And I think this renter subjectivity idea is still something that people are playing around with or trying to build different versions of.
Yeah, I guess two things from that, like, and you mentioned this at the beginning, I think, of the book and maybe even of our conversation today, how, like, you know, maybe you came to this sort of activism via things like Occupy and other sort of ephemeral social movements of that nature. And I guess we could include like the Corbynism moment, if you like, or few years as well, which drew a lot of energy into that party political direction. But it feels like it didn't really leave a lasting infrastructure. I mean, that's debatable perhaps, but once the left lost its sort of very flimsy control of the Labour Party, it was evicted, as it were, from that political space. So tenant unions feel like they are a means through which we can build more sort of enduring institutions, as sort of an infrastructure, if you like, of resistance, even though they're still, relatively speaking, in their infancy. I guess another thing which I wanted to say is going back to what you were talking about, how it needs to become pretty unremarkable thing, like to state, oh yes, I'm in a tenants union. It can just be like, oh yeah, that's a normal thing. It doesn't require explanation. I think you make a really important point at the end of the book about narrative, which maybe links back to the stuff around identity. That's kind of narrative we tell ourselves. But, you know, how our actions, particularly, you know, maybe the more disruptive actions that the union might take, that all has to be legible as understandable and necessary. So communicating a compelling and positive narrative is vital. And, because it's not enough for conditions to just be bad. I mean, we know that, like, the right is very capable of feeding off terrible conditions with its sort of oven-ready narratives of, scroungers, migrants, benefits cheats, and all the rest. And that can seem persuasive and commonsensical to people. So, do you feel like part of this organising work is the ability to offer compelling counter-narratives that make sense to sort of ordinary people?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really important for tenant unions to have a narrative not just about how bad the situation is, how bad the housing crisis is, but about how to get out of it and how participation in a tenant union is going to help us get out of it. Again, I would say that because tenant unions are quite young, they're still to some extent working on this. What is the route out of housing crisis that tenant unions offer? It differs between different tenant unions, and in some ways it's not always very well worked out. There's a dependence just on, we really have a bad housing situation, we'd better work on this. Now, I think it's easy to leap to solutions such as, well, let's build public housing. And that's a reasonable thing to say. We should build public housing. But it's also important to think about, well, what feels good to the people that you are trying to recruit. And maybe they've had experience of bad public housing. So they need to understand why it is that the housing you want to see is going to be better than the bad experience they've had in the past. Tenant unions need to offer the feeling that whatever their proposed solution is to the housing crisis, whatever they think housing should look like, there's a way to get from here to there that is legible to somebody you might just recruit on the street, or to your neighbour, or to someone you speak to at work. What is the way forward that is legible to them? And this again harks back a bit to the tension around being anti-capitalist organisations, because a lot of the time if the narrative you offer is just, well, we just need to end capitalism, even if people theoretically agree with that, they might just say, well, we don't have a path where I can see the way to do that in the next 10 years. So what is the path? So I think tenant unions are still working on their narratives around this. What excites me is when they begin to present sort of positive solutions that you could just sort of present to people. In Ireland, part of what they say about public housing is that, well, it's not just going to be about building. We're going to try and pull housing from the private sector into the public sector, decommodify houses individually, get them from the landlords into the public sector. And that's something people can imagine happening, because you can set up a process, a legal and financial process for doing that. So I think positive proposals like that are quite important, because I have recruited for a tenant union on the street, and sometimes the response you get from people when you're trying to recruit them is just, well, I agree with you, but I just don't see a way forward. What is your way forward? And if you can't answer them in 3 or 4 lines, you've lost them already. So I think this is something that, as I say, because tenant unions are still young, I think they're still working on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess tenant unions, given that a lot of the understanding is that these are systemic issues, they're issues of capitalism ultimately, therefore have to be coordinating or part of a broader movement, I suppose. It's too much to ask a tenant union to fix everything, because housing is only one sort of part of a wider set of like issues with the way that the world is run, that the economy is run, and so on. Do you feel like, even sticking within housing actually, do you feel like there is potential for homeowners, maybe people who are also feeling quite precarious actually? Do you see homeowners as being like potential allies to the movement?
Yeah, I think it's really important for tenant unions to build alliances. And just in terms of numbers, in the UK, if you want to build a majority for real change in the housing system, you're going to have to get homeowners on board in some way or other, right? Because owner-occupier is still the largest tenure in the country. It is dropping, but it's still the largest tenure. And really, if you don't get homeowners on board, you might struggle with implementing really large-scale changes. Now, not all tenant unions are interested in trying to get homeowners on board, particularly. Although in the UK, there's a tenure called shared ownership, where you sort of own half the house and you rent half of it from a housing association. I think increasingly tenant unions see the need to recruit those people because they are partially tenants, as well as being partial homeowners. I think the question of what alliances tenant unions are going to form in general, I think is still an open question. Again, this is something tenant unions are still working on. I think there's possibly positive ways forward in trying to recruit to your cause some of those parents of the current generation who can't buy, and who perhaps also don't have enough to support their children. Recruiting some of those homeowners to really be on your side in a campaigning sense as well. That's not something that has happened so far, I would say, but I think there's potential there. In terms of broader alliances, I think it is really important that tenant unions form alliances beyond the housing sector as well, because these issues that they're talking about, the rentier economy, the takeover by asset owners and so on, these actually go well beyond housing. They affect workplaces, they affect pay, they affect our public spaces. If you want the things that you need as a person to not be commodities, to not be owned by private equity or something, then that's a big political project, and you need everyone you can get on your side. So I think trade unions in particular, people talk about as being vital allies to tenant unions. It's kind of an obvious one. A lot of those alliances at the moment are more conceptual than real, as in people have not yet found the ways to act together, because that would be the key, right, to really bringing together trade unions and tenant unions is you bring them together in united action. That hasn't happened very much yet, but I very much hope it will in the near future. And people are always talking about it, always thinking, what is it that can get us working together in a really concerted way?
You know, the book came out in February, and presumably you finished writing it several months before that. So is there anything that's happened since you finished writing the book that you think is worth mentioning here, or perhaps any directions in which you see the housing justice movement travelling?
I suppose the key thing that's happened since I wrote the book is that it has become more clear than ever that fascism is on the rise in much of the global north. Of course, that's become very abundantly clear in the US, but it's also increasingly clear in, France, Germany, Spain, the UK. And so, to some extent, we know what our enemy looks like. And we know enough to be really worried that they might actually get in power, or that they already are in power. So I think tenant unions, like every organisation of the left, needs to be thinking quite explicitly about the conditions that fascism has been thriving on, and about the problems of centrist parties that have allowed this fascism to thrive and gone unchallenged often. A big part of the equation of why the far right has been on the rise is the scarcity that people feel in their lives. It's not the only issue. It's not the only issue, because undoubtedly, a number of people do have sort of embedded racist beliefs and ideologies that also contribute to this. And there's perhaps nothing you can do to convince them that migration is a net positive to their lives, or that the people who are migrating are real human beings. There are people that you're just never going to convince, but there's also a lot of people who are just very worried about the scarcity that neoliberalism has engendered in their lives, and that scarcity in healthcare, in housing, and the feeling that there is not enough to go around means that people are just sick of all these centrist politicians. So all leftist organisations, I think, and that includes tenant unions, need to be stepping forward with really strong ideas about why it is that we don't have to live with scarcity. We don't have to live with housing scarcity. We need to be saying that really boldly and clearly, and laying out ways in which we can resolve the housing crises that people are experiencing personally. The advantage of tenant unions in responding to the rise of fascism is also this element of them that's about building community, because it means that you get to know your neighbours who might be recent migrants, and they're no longer just figures in a newspaper. They become real people to you, and I think that's a really important part of the anti-fascist organising as well, is showing people that the community that they live in can include everyone, and that the people they live next door to deserve a home and a good life as much as they do.
Brilliant. Well, Jacob, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking to me. It's been a great conversation, and I really enjoyed the book. There's a lot more that we didn't talk about, and that's fine. People can go away, find a copy, and get better acquainted. So once again, it's called Renters Unite, How Tenant Unions Are Fighting the Housing Crisis, and it's out now from Pluto Press. So yeah, Jacob, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Jacob Stringer on Radicals and Conversation. Once again, the new book, Renters Unite, How Tenant Unions Are Fighting the Housing Crisis, is available now through plutobooks.com, and followers of the podcast can get 40% off. You just have to use the coupon podcasts at the checkout. As ever, if you enjoy the show, then please do hit the subscribe button and share the link among your networks as well. We'll be back with our next episode in just a few weeks' time. So until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.